The terror threat represented by ISIS remains a major concern for our country as well as our allies in Europe. American International College professor Gary Lefort, a retired military officer who served in the Middle East, sat down with Carolee McGrath to give us his perspective.
I mean, I think it's not only a matter of additional troops in Syria, but also Iraq as well. We're much farther along as far as Iraq goes. We've just about pushed out ISIS in Mosul, which is their capital in Iraq. And then from there, we'll end up moving into Syria. I think as far as Iraq goes, don't be surprised if you see an increase in troops, because I think after ISIS is pushed out of the country, the United States, from lessons learned, is going to try to keep a military force in place much larger than the current 5,000 men, so that we can preclude ISIS or Al-Qaeda coming back into that country.
So there's different philosophies over the years about ISIS, and do you contain them or do you eradicate them, as President Trump has promised to do? Is that possible?
No, I don't think it's possible to eradicate it, just like we tried to eradicate Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and we found that that was not possible. We certainly have disrupted their organization, their infrastructure, and I think that's the best that we can do as far as ISIS goes. We need to push ISIS out of out of Iraq, out of Syria. Then we need to push it out of its strongholds in Yemen, Afghanistan, Libya, and then fragment the organization. Now, of course, they'll go to other parts of the world because of terrorism global reach, but I think that's much more containable than the current situation that we have in Syria and in Iraq. But totally eradicating them, I just don't know if that's within the realm of possibility.
Do we work with Russia?
Well, Russia, is a key player, certainly as far as Syria, not as far as Iraq goes. And Russia is, has an agreement with the president of Assad that he was invited into the country to help against terrorism. So I don't see how the United States can go into Syria and not negotiate or at least coordinate with the Russian, military, especially as far as air operations go. If you don't do that, recognizing the fact that they have a different focus. Russia seems to be more focused on terrorism, but the rebel, the Syrian rebel terrorist element rather than outright ISIS, whereas in the case of the United States, we're focused more on the ISIS threat. And so there is that possibility. There could be at times different air operations, and if you don't coordinate it, then you could certainly have an air incident, an air crash, for example, or the bombing of Russian troops or American troops, and who knows where that could lead.
This is an extremely complicated situation, and certainly Assad, is not a choir boy. So how do you proceed in this situation, keeping American interests, at the forefront? How do you do it?
Well, you would hope that you could, in the case of Syria, negotiate with the Russians that the focus would be to drive out ISIS. Once that's been done, of trying in an international forum, possibly through the United Nations, to sit down and come up with some type of a political solution that would create a new government in Syria that I doubt very much if it could be headed up and still be effective with President Assad. As to whether or not his willingness to go, especially with Russian support, is a whole other question. But they do have to sit down once they eliminate ISIS and come to terms with the rebel elements within the country and the current government.
How difficult is it with all the technology that we have today to combat ISIS when they have all of these? You have Facebook, which is passé now, and Twitter and everything else, and they're able to recruit in such a way that has never been possible. How difficult is it to combat them with all of the technology on their side?
It's extremely difficult, and probably the biggest threat that we have from ISIS, especially after, say, we push them out of Libya, Afghanistan, is that they do a lot of recruiting as far as the social media goes. And they do it on a global basis. In every country, there are always people who are dissatisfied with the status quo, with the government, with their way of life. They may be of the Islamic faith and not happy with the way that Muslims in other parts of the world, like Syria, are being treated. And so young people like that are very, very easily radicalized. And so I think the biggest threat globally is probably the lone wolf, or the country-based citizen who may be from an Middle Eastern country that feels that his religion is being mistreated. And that's the hard part. That's why I don't know if you can really end up eradicating Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any terrorist type groups like that that have a global reach, because they can reach down into the bowels of a country and always find those who are disenchanted or unhappy.
And don't you run the risk of them being able to recruit more people? You know, if the U.S. looks like, you know, the big bad military U.S., here they come again. I mean, doesn't that help them recruit, you know, young men and women who are dissatisfied?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. And, you know, and sometimes it's not necessarily, you know, religious related, in that it's not a Muslim. It's just a young person who feels disenchanted or overlooked or abused or bullied that looks for a cause. And ISIS, through the social media, for example, which they have really perfected quite well, you know, is able to reach out to them and slowly radicalize them.
And ultimately, what's their goal?
I guess, you know, if you ask ISIS, they would say that they would like to establish a Middle East caliphate that would reach out to all parts of the world, not only the Middle East, but in other parts of the country, other parts of the world where there's very, very large Muslims population. I think in the process of trying to do that, they're trying to drive out the Western influences, like the United States, like Europe, that they feel has, you know, resulted in the deteriorating of their religion, and, you know, in what they stand for.
All right, Professor Lefort, thank you so much. This is a broad topic, but it'll be interesting.
It is. And we've just, you know,
we just scratched
the
the
tip
surface.
of the iceberg,
That's right.
so to speak.
Interesting to see what happens in the weeks and months to come. Thank you so much for coming in.